just there we go, nailing it. And then what can we do about predictive outcomes for supporting people with a brain injury? And I see we've got Jordan on the call, and she works with a company called New Mind out of, I believe they're out of Atlanta, and they do a lot of EEG analysis and treatment from the neurofeedback side. And they have a great, protocol that they've built around that. We work a little more on the neurostimulation side now. So we do still do neurofeedback, but what we've started to develop is actually our own device where we're able to do transcranial stimulation to the brain post-concussion to increase blood flow, oxygen, and actually restabilize the electrical patterning. So we really step in this kind of 30-day out model. So for the people that have had a brain injury, maybe they have some whiplash involved, we know that there can be a lot of pain. We know there's going to be a lot of stress. And that's really where we rely on that current medical model to assess and diagnose and treat. A lot of that's directed towards PT and OT. Unfortunately, even up here in, Vail, where we're at today, Vail Health, which has a great branch called Howard Head, they even fall short referring to their own physical therapists. So a lot of people within the brain injury community are not actually referring even within their own companies. And we're talking about roughly 2.5 to 4 million concussions per year. So there's quite a significant need. I think thankfully we've moved away from just telling people not to sleep. I think that was kind of this common myth of don't sleep there, and this isn't medical advice, but we're starting to understand actually that unless there's like increasing cranial pressure or a brain bleed, which is super important to be able to diagnose, we've actually caught 2 in our office and sent them back to the emergency room. So, if anyone does have a concussion, it is super important to get that assessed so there's not that risk of increasing ICP, which can lead to death. But we are learning that, if we take care of our diet, if we sleep well, if we move active, or if we remain active at the level we're able to, we can actually get back to perform to the level that perhaps we were at, or at least be able to develop and hit an area of what we call post-traumatic growth, which is basically could be simplified as you're not the same person in which you were prior to an injury or the event, but you actually have growth and development as a person. And that's really where we see our role stepping in. So is everyone roughly familiar with this idea of concussions? I know there's been a lot of press over the last decade around what a concussion is. Basically, it can be looked at as an impact to the head. You could have a subconcussive impact. This is if anyone remembers the talk about soccer and too many head balls and giving people concussions from that would be an example of a subconcussive blow versus a concussive blow, which might look at loss of consciousness or lack of orientation to self, place, time, right? There's different ways in which that can be assessed from more of the emergency medical service end model. What's really interesting about the concussion, really what we'll call the post-concussive syndrome, so looking at that 30-day out window, is that people have really different responses. Where I was down at the Brain Injury Alliance in Denver a couple of years ago, and there's only one person that had reported they felt like they were better after their concussion. Someone's wife said that their husband was actually nicer. Typically the result or response from a concussion is that people become moody, they become angry. There can be emotions that come without an understanding. So we've had people in our chairs doing neurofeedback that are just crying and not understanding why, because it can be an inability to regulate mood. We see a lot of headaches, a lot of vestibular balance challenges, sleep disorders leading from sleeping all night but not being able to get enough rest, or feeling like they got enough rest to not being able to fall asleep or waking up at different points during the night, as well as anxiety and depression. But it's important when we're assessing or when we're thinking about either been a friend that might have had a concussion, that we really remember that they're still a person, right? That we're not just treating a disorder. We're looking at what are they actually experiencing and how can we support them to feel more stable, to get this, their needs met in whichever way that might look. So in our process at Amazing Brains, what we're doing is seeing people roughly 30 days post-injury. I'm going to actually switch over again and do the screen share just because I got the slides. And I think, I saw Carly just hopped on, which is cool because we're going to talk about some hyperbaric stuff. I know she's local. And I know there's a couple of you also on this that like that type of approach. I'd love to know why this is not. There we go. So when I was talking about EEG analysis, this is actually an image. It should be going across the screen. Unfortunately, it's not. So when we're doing a brain map or analysis on someone, this is what the squiggly lines over here. This is what we call morphology, and or raw data. And on the right, this is what we call quantified data. And you can see that there's actually a lot of variation. So we have fast, kind of high, fast frequency waves. And then we also have a slower wave, which is this background right here. And that's showing up as delta. That's actually an artifact from skin sweat, it looks like. But when we have the brain injury, we tend to see an increase in slow brain waves like delta and theta. And those are actually associated with death of white matter or gray matter. So it's really interesting to be able to look at the brain and say, there's been slowing. It's very helpful to have a baseline data so that we know where someone was and where someone is. This is looking at eyes open and eyes closed data. We can also do something called ERP, which is where we're looking at the brain's power and response time to a stimuli. And that's one of the, I think, preferred, from a neurologist standpoint, one of the preferred ways to look at the impact. And typically what you're seeing is a slowing of the brain, and that's that self-protective mechanism. Okay. So, if this is somebody that or this is somebody that maybe it is you, or if you're a professional and you're working with somebody, there's an awful lot of different things you can do to support yourself through the recovery and healing process. Our specialty is obviously EEG. I think having any type of imaging, I know there's some people on this call that have used Q-spec scans. There's DTI, there's a lot of different imaging, but any way in which you're able to quantify electrical activity or blood flow or structuring of the brain, that can be really helpful to understand the extent of the damage, as well as ruling out any types of bleeds. I really should have this first, but really rest and recover, like minimizing screen time, eating really well, and keeping up your fitness as much as possible is helpful. I know for a lot of people that's not possible. We recently worked with an athlete that broke his neck and had a concussion quite significantly. And, over the course of about 15 sessions, we were able to support him to go from not being able to walk for more than 5 minutes to be able to run a sub 10-minute mile, which was a pretty amazing trajectory. He was about 9 months post-injury when we started working with him. But, knowing that some of you all are, not in Colorado, I'd strongly encourage you to look at hyperbaric treatments. I think the low inflammation diet, there's a lot of effects on when our head is hit, and we have something called axonal shearing, which is disrupting basically our brain cells. We can actually create a toxic response in the brain. So anytime we're able to reduce inflammation in the brain and body, that's super helpful. I know we have some experts on stem cells in here today. I think that that's a pretty amazing way to support people in the healing process. We focus on brain training, so neurofeedback and neurostimulation. Briefly, for those of you that are not aware of what neurofeedback is, it's basically operant conditioning, so rewards and inhibits. And you'd use a brain-computer interface. So you'd hook up a sensor to someone's head. It would monitor the electrical activity. And then you would reward somebody if they move into a different wavelength that you're wanting to, or inhibit if they're not. And that's done with, say, you're watching a movie. The movie would be playing and you could hear the sound if you're doing it right. And if you're not, then all of a sudden the image would go away, or the sound would go away. One of the interesting pieces and reasons we've moved away from neurofeedback in our office, we still do it for remote training, and we actually have an app now that, so anywhere in the world, we can do EEG analysis through that cloud-based machine platform, but also be able to train your brain remotely. But we do a lot more of the neurostimulation because when we're in that post-concussive syndrome or post-concussion world, oftentimes there's an inherent disorganization and fogginess, and that's not exactly the best, what's the right word for that? It's not where you want to learn, right? If you think about studying for a test, you want to feel sharp, you want to be well rested, well hydrated, well fed, and if you're in a foggy, disoriented, chaotic state, which is often what happens post-brain injury, we found that the use of transcranial stimulation not only helps organize the EEG, so electrical patternings faster, but we're able to increase blood flow and oxygen to levels similar to hyperbaric for about 60 minutes post-treatment. So I still think, adding hyperbaric and doing these kind of layered treatments, doing all of this really is the best. And this isn't meant to be a comprehensive list, just rather kind of a teaser of what is out there. But we've seen really good results with that. We're also starting to see good results using ketamine. I know there's some people on the call that have used that in the past, but the increase of neuroplasticity through the use of ketamine seems to be really helpful for the recovery process. And there's some additives to those IV infusions that can reduce inflammation as well. So we talked a little bit about the brain training capabilities, EEG and QEEG. This is our old style cap. We actually have a new cap now that uses only saline. So if anyone ever comes into our office, we don't have to get your hair all gelled up anymore. And that's, I think, been a really nice piece for people. So just taking a look at the notes. I'm going to kind of hop off the screen share, just because it's not my favorite thing to not see your all's smiley faces, although most of you are not sharing your images. But that's kind of the overview. And I think the thing that really hits home for most people is that when they've had a concussion, they just don't feel like themselves. And this is where that humanistic and being trained as trauma-informed therapists, and our coaches are trained in the same way as well, is that we're really wanting to make sure we're meeting that person to understand where they're at psychologically, mentally, emotionally, physically, and then also assess the underlying patterns in their brain and body, right? That'd be where biofeedback would come in, but we won't go down that rabbit hole too much. And when we start to think about, hey, this is somebody who's feeling anxious, or this is somebody who's feeling depressed, we can then look at the signatures and start seeing that we know that when someone's had a concussion, they will most likely have higher amounts of delta or theta in the brain. And those are two slower brain waves that are associated with brain fog, distractibility, depression, and even anxiety. So we typically think about anxiety as a fast pattern, but there's a way in which when we're not able to track the world around us, that we default to a fear response. So when we have that slowing in our brain and that disorganization in our brain, all of a sudden everything becomes more challenging for people. And we can also see sleep disorders stem from that. So really the whole goal is to understand where somebody's at, find an associative neural marker or biomarker, and then help guide them into feeling better and having that what we call mobility or range between a waking state or a resting state. And that's kind of to overlay the therapy terms. A waking state is focus, but also can be anxiety or a sleep disorder. A resting state is sleep, but can also be brain fog and distractibility. So it's just a really simple way to kind of step out of the diagnostic frameworks and into just a more relatable way of, hey, are you having a hard time falling asleep or staying awake? Are you overactivated or feeling anxious? And when we think about it in that terms, it's a lot easier to look at a brain map or to look at somebody's clinical intake and start understanding that there's a whole process that that person can be walked through to help them feel, supported and stabilized. As you can tell, we're a big fan of the multimodal approach. We have massage therapists in our office, we have psychotherapists, we have ketamine and IV therapies. We're looking at building out more of a recovery lab. We do a lot of different modalities, and that's because everyone's going to be different. And our goal is to be able to support that person and help them to find the right person for them to be supported by, right? And, for the years I worked as a therapist, it's really clear that we can be skillful at our job, but if we don't have rapport and connection with somebody coming in, if we're not able to build that trust with them, it's a lot harder for somebody to get the results and feel the benefits that they're wanting to get. And that's why I really see this side of the neurotherapy is actually can be adjunctive to physical therapy, PT, or sorry, I guess that's PT, OT, psychotherapy, hyperbaric, all chiropractic, massage. We're really just supporting somebody's system to move through that trauma that they've gone through to help re-regulate and stabilize their brain so they can actually learn and feel better post-injury. So I think that's probably about as much talking at as you guys would enjoy. I'm going to leave, our website is amazingbrains.com. So if anyone is interested in working with us or learning more, if you go to that website, there's a page called Get Started. You can click on that and you can do a consultation with myself or Melanie, even if you're not looking for services for yourself, but you just have some questions that we maybe don't get to in the next part of this. That's a great way to reach out to us. We really try to be an open book and believe that this world of neurotherapy is so young that the more we can support the field, the more we can publish research and outcomes, the better really it is for everybody involved. So I'm going to open it up for any questions. I know some of you joined later on in this, and I did record most of it. I forgot for the first couple minutes, but I will be able to send out a recording afterwards. But yeah, is there anyone have any questions about the presentation? No, it was just crystal clear. That's always you're either afraid to ask the question or I was just so precise and clear in my languaging that I've, accomplished my goal.
There we go. Can you hear me?
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. It's been a while.
It has been a while. I love that you talked about the multimodal approach, just because every head injury is different, every head is different, and so it really does take a toolbox of things to approach something like that. I know the head injuries that I've had, riding horses and things like that, there wasn't a whole lot of, here's what you need to do, then you need to do this or something like that. It was just like, well, lay on the couch for a while and we'll see how it goes. And so there's not a lot of, even now with all the research that's out there, there's not a lot of like common knowledge of what to do with a head injury. So I like that you said, unless you are having some sort of medical emergency, sleep is fine.
Yeah.
Okay. In fact, it's probably a thing you should do.
100%. Yeah, and I think, that's for, we can dive into the nervous system functionality, but anytime we can get somebody into that, what we call ventral vagal, or what people most commonly call the parasympathetic state, they're going to help. That's going to help you and aid your recovery at a cellular level. I think that was that, getting people in a fearful state. That's not always the greatest thing for recovery.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right.
See you, Adrian. Thanks for being here. We had someone hopping out. Sam had an interesting question I was going to dive into, unless you wanted to dive more into that, Jordan.
No, please.
So, Sam, you were asking about TMS and TBI. So for those not familiar, transcranial magnetic stimulation is different than what we do, which is transcranial alternating current or direct current stimulation. So TMS is going to be a much more powerful magnetic stimulation that can actually, be excitatory to motor neurons to the level of be able to get someone's arm to move. And typically that's done, Sam, you probably know more about TMS than I do since we don't do it. But that is done at different frequencies. A lot of machines are kind of tuned to 1 hertz or 10 hertz or delta or alpha kind of respectively. But I know that other machines can be tuned to a variety of frequencies. And then you also asked about depth. So I'm going to answer this question a little differently because of the way that we work with stuff. With transcranial alternating current, it's actually a bit more similar to what we'd see with a neurofeedback approach. So we put the cap on, and in the US, we use something called the 1020 measurement sites. So these are just different ways to mark on the head different lobes or sites, and each one of those sites is connected with different brain functions or different regions. And we will then put the electrode, which they look about like that, if you can all see, fairly small, and onto the head at a specific site. There's some preliminary mapping of the way the current moves through the brain. I think that is one of the challenges with all brain-based therapies, is that we don't know as much about the brain as I think any of us would like. We are able to run at certainly any brain frequency from, we go down to 0.01 to all the way up into the gamma or even higher spectrum in terms of frequencies. Like the Fisher-Wallace device runs at like 1400 hertz. A lot of what we're doing is actually feeding in a specific brainwave in the hope to entrain or increase that brainwave. So what that means is, if we want to increase, say, 10 hertz, then we feed in 10 hertz, and then the brain starts to create that patterning. And for anyone that's familiar with binaural beats or have ever seen the flashing lights glasses, like I know NewMind has, uses the flashing lights. These are all just different ways to increase a specific frequency in that brain. There's been some kind of negative press around the penetration into the skull around different modalities, ranging from transcranial stimulation or photobiomodulation, which is near infrared light. But what some of the most recent articles I've read on this topic are actually showing that the way, once you penetrate the skull, especially with, say, photobiomodulation, is that it acts itself as an amplifier and as a bowl. So you're actually getting really good penetration. And in our work with Loretta, which is a type of imaging that can triangulate and find the origin or the source of a certain type of electrical firing, we're actually seeing results and shifting of depth structures, or I should say of depth patterning, not necessarily the structure. We're not changing the cellular, like the gray matter in the brain in that way. So I think there's a little bit there that's not fully understood by myself, and I think really for the whole field of what the true mechanism of action, and even the function on like GABA versus glutamate, and whether it's excitatory and inhibitory functions. So we can go down a rabbit hole on that, but hopefully that kind of answers your question a little bit around it. And I think for anyone considering TMS or RTMS, it's an amazing modality. And I think the more that we have kind of what I call the informed consent model of like, hey, there's a ton of things, like you might do really well with this diet, or you might do really well with hyperbaric or neurofeedback or TMS. Like neurofeedback and TMS are both neurotherapies, but they're on very different ends of the spectrum in terms of power, intensity, and risk. But they both have amazing outcomes for treatment. And just the more we can be informed as providers or as consumers or as people, patients that are in need, I think the better it is for people to have those choices. So, yeah, cool. We'll see you, Aaron. Thanks for dropping by. Any other? You're welcome, Mr. Peterson. I will say, if we're rabbit holing, I'll get to your question in a second, Carly. If we're rabbit holing a little bit here in a fun way, I hope, One of the things our friend Farouk is doing in Canada with TMS is building predictive outcomes so that he can look at EEG, well, really the computers can look at EEG patterns and have an idea for what somebody's likelihood would be to succeed with TMS. And right now he says they're able to predict that out to 3. So within 3 sessions, they'll let you know if you're a responder or a non-responder. And I know that we're hoping to stand on the shoulders of that work to support, neurofeedback and the transcranial direct and alternating current treatments so that we can have more predictive outcomes and better research to say like, hey, here's the quantified approach. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting knowing that there's interest in TMS on this call, and especially in Vail, a company just got a TMS machine. I don't think they know how to run it very well, so that's a little like red flaggy to me, but you all do your homework before you put somebody in control of your brainwaves, and there's different board certifications and education, and just trust your gut when you're working with somebody. How far out do you work with people? You mentioned 60 days. So right now, the best literature I could find on waiting is 30 days. So 30 days out, we'll start working with somebody with neurostimulation. Neurofeedback, I've seen people do a lot sooner. The work we do with self-regulation, breath work, coaching, somatic experiencing, which is a trauma-based approach to therapy, that can be done immediately after. And oftentimes when somebody's had a concussion, right, that might be from something like slipping on an icy parking lot. It could be from a significant, bike injury. It could be from a blast. It could be from all these different things. Most likely there is a trauma signature stuck in the body. So there's some way in which there's been an inhibition of somebody's motor movements or response to something because there was a loss of consciousness. And this takes us really deep into a branch of something, the nervous system called the dorsal vagal branch, which is really where we get faint freeze disassociation. And when we move through what we call thawing that freeze, there's oftentimes a kind of warming up of the body. This could be anxious, this could be fear, this could be anger. So when someone moves out of that and reorients and restabilizes, there's an awful lot of work that really needs to be done and should be done with somebody who's either skillful as a trauma therapist or a somatically trained person, a body worker that has a basic understanding of polyvagal theory, which is the theory of the vagus nerve, which I was just alluding to. I apologize for getting deeper in the words, but looking at the names I know on here, I'm guessing most of you know what I'm talking about. So hopefully I didn't lose you on that. But really, when it comes to putting the electricity through the brain, we're waiting 30 days until research clears us to do it earlier. But people are welcome to come in much earlier, and we can even do EEG analysis prior to doing that work so we can see what changes happened over those 30 days. So, yeah. Thanks for your question, Carly. And I think, I'm curious if you want to comment on how soon after you'll see. So Carly runs, is it called Breckenridge Hyperbaric or High Country Hyperbaric? Has a hyperbaric chamber in Breck and in Boulder. But I'm curious how far out you're waiting until you'll put somebody in the chamber. Oh, all good, no problem. Will anyone else have questions about concussions or the work we're doing, kind of how we look at this, or just want to share a personal experience around recovery? Or feel free. Oh, Carly says she likes to wait 30 days as well. And I think that I'm guessing part of this for you and for all of us is that there is a certain level of most people are going to have a recovery in that time. Yeah, irritating the symptoms if you go too early. That can be definitely a risk. The brain has its natural healing cycles. If anyone else wants to jump in and comment on what they see for that. feel free to. I know that in our work in pediatric concussions, we often, one of the big challenges we see with concussion is that the symptoms can come on very, very late. So someone could have 6 months later experience significant brain fog and they don't understand why it's happening. Sometimes that's because they have an increase of stress. And one of the ways that we look at stress in the brain is an increase of theta waves or delta waves when we get into these oxidative stress, meaning chronic and actually doing damage to the brain. And that can actually exacerbate previous injuries like a concussion. We can also, I think it's worth mentioning, and I see Court's on here, I bet he has a couple things to say about this, but blood flow, a lot of concussions can involve whiplash, and anytime we change blood flow, that's to the brain, we're going to see pretty significant increases of symptoms. So we've had people go to get their atlas adjusted, and that's resolved a lot of their symptomology. So what up, Court?
Hey, great to be here. Sorry, this is scheduled exactly at the same time that I'm picking up my boys. So
good, man.
We're walking home. Dude, this is just amazing stuff you're putting out there. Are you guys seeing any big changes in the dorsal lateral system, or maybe interoception as you're progressing through this? I mean, we're doing a lot of post-concussion syndrome recovery work over, in Z and stuff like that as well. But I'd be curious to see what's going on with maybe pain tolerance or descending inhibition. And obviously that's a huge focus for us at REMAP. So
yeah, 100%. I mean, I think, yeah, especially when you have those deeper kind of short answers, yes. Right.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I think that, what you guys do at REMAP and Z Health, and, Z Health is really cool. You guys want to look it up. It's really cool. And REMAP is kind of integrating that type of work with psychedelic work and phantom limb pain and all sorts of stuff. Probably butchering what you're doing, but just to give people an overview of that.
Nope. That's as good a summary as any.
Yeah, I mean, anytime, interoception, for those that aren't familiar with the term, is basically your awareness of your body inside of your body. Proprioception is your awareness of your body in space and time. And when you have impact on the vestibular system, you can see really significant changes to your proprioception and interoception. You can see, this is, people often talk about for phantom limb pain, and you and I need to talk about the meeting I had with the Navy a couple of weeks ago. But, the kind of line is, when you lose your arm, the worst pain you've ever felt is in the fingers that aren't there anymore. And learning to remap and remove from like a sensory motor standpoint is incredibly valuable. Quantifying that in EEG and biofeedback would probably be a longer conversation, but happy to have it.
But that would be such amazing data points to have. I was having a nice talk with Jesse of Heroic Hearts, and there's a few other folks, and like I don't see why we can't all be piggybacking on each other's studies. It's like right now it's just a huge team effort, and I think there's just so much stuff that's literally just sitting out there uncollected that could be amazingly useful. So this is really exciting to hear.
Yeah, and Dr. Kate was on here earlier as well, if you're familiar with her, like Kate Pates, who works with.
Oh yeah, no, I follow her. So great to see.
Sweet. So I'm going to shift gears to Sam's EEG question. So when Sam's asking basically, do you typically see an increase of delta and theta waves at the site of injury, or are they more diffuse through the brain? So you can imagine if you have an injury, say you hit your head, the complication of that statement is you have a primary and secondary injury. So meaning if you hit the front of your head, your brain is going to move forward and hit your head, and then move to the back and then hit in a secondary spot. So certainly, yes, typically you're going to see those brain waves increase at the site of the injury. We can also have something called axonal shearing. So if we think about the axons in our brain, which are really delicate structures with proteins around them, and this is where we get into kind of what we'd call the like CTE and like the tau proteins and all that stuff. When that hits on the ridges on the side of our head and it can actually release toxins into our brain, that's where I think you can see a more diffuse patterning. I should have written this down beforehand because my dyslexia is getting me the best of me. But an increase of theta is associated with white matter death, and the increase of delta is I feel like it's either way. One is associated with white matter and the other one's gray matter. I don't really remember in this moment. It's somewhere in my notes, but you can kind of get an idea then of like the true impact of that injury. And Sam, I know you have access to the WAVI system, which is going to also do the ERP testing for you, as well as the eyes closed, eyes open baseline. So, you're also tying that in with like the microvolt change of response time, as well as like the P300 time of response. And all those tests are really built off this idea that cortical slowing, which is a protective mechanism, is ultimately what we're doing to keep ourselves safe. And if we think about why then are we moody or foggy or anxious and having slowing sleep challenges, it's all just in hopes of protecting. And this is, I think, back to what you were saying, Jordan, it's in hopes of protecting ourselves, and it's hope of helping ourselves heal. And what we've learned from more of the multimodal kind of cooler approaches to health and healing is that happens a lot better when we have human to human contact, when we're able to sleep, when we're able to regulate. And that's actually a measurable thing from, say, a biofeedback, heart rate variability, skin temperature, skin sweat, muscle tension. All these are different ways to measure how regulated you are. So yeah, I think we probably have time for one more. We definitely got on the nerdier side, which is what I was kind of anticipating looking at the names in the crowd. Yeah, Court's liking it. Yeah, anyone else have questions? We're going to continue to do these every 2 weeks. We'll probably cycle through some stuff like brain fog, not just concussions. This is just one that we're currently putting a lot of energy into because we see a lot of people, especially with our partnerships with some of the local hospitals. But if anyone has another question, or if you have a request for different topics, leave it in the comments below. And then I shared the link to amazingbrains.com, and you feel free to go there and you can set up a consult or through our scheduling link, or email us at hello@amazingbrains.com, and someone will get back to you. You're welcome, Melanie. Anyway, thank you all for joining. Thanks, David. Good to see you here. And yeah, hopefully we can all catch up soon. It was cool to see you're all like some names I haven't seen in a long time. So yeah.
Thank you for this.